On a moonless night, I found myself driving along an isolated highway that seemed to stretch into eternity. My headlights cut through the inky blackness, but they revealed nothing more than the narrowing road ahead. My name is Alex, and I was on my way to visit a childhood friend who had moved to a remote cabin deep in the wilderness. The reasons behind my journey were rooted in a desperate attempt to rekindle a friendship that had withered over the years. A sense of foreboding gnawed at me as the desolation of the surroundings intensified. With each mile, the towering trees on either side seemed to close in, forming an oppressive tunnel of darkness. I was well aware of the eerie stories that circulated about this isolated region, tales of strange disappearances and haunting encounters with a relentless creature they called the Silence. It wasn't just the name that sent shivers down my spine, but the sense of dread that seemed to cling to every tree and blade of grass, whispering that I was far from welcome in this forsaken place. My friend James had always been the adventurous type, and his decision to live in such seclusion was no surprise. He had invited me for a visit, promising that it would be an unforgettable experience. As I continued down the winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was hurtling towards something far more unforgettable than I had ever imagined. The midnight hour had long passed when my car suddenly sputtered to a halt. Panic welled up as I tried to restart the engine, but it remained stubbornly silent. I had no cell signal, and the cabin was still miles away. My heart raced in my chest as I contemplated my options. The silence of the night was now more than just unsettling. It felt like a malevolent presence closing in around me. With a flashlight in hand, I stepped out of the car and began the long walk along the road. The oppressive silence grew heavier with each step, and I could hear my footsteps echoing through the trees, a disconcerting sound in the otherwise deserted night. It was when the woods on both sides seemed to be closing in, their branches reaching out to snatch me, that I saw the faint glimmer of a lantern ahead. Relief washed over me as I approached the cabin, its cozy glow radiating warmth and safety. A weathered man with a graying beard who introduced himself as Daniel greeted me at the door. He lived alone in the wilderness, tending to his cabin in the forest. I told him about my predicament, and he welcomed me inside, offering to help in the morning. Despite his eccentric lifestyle, I felt a sense of gratitude and settled in for the night. As I lay on the creaky floor trying to rest, I noticed the odd carvings and symbols adorning the walls. It seemed as if they told a story of their own, one I couldn't decipher. Just as sleep was about to claim me, I heard the faintest rustling from outside and my eyes snapped open. It was the sound of whispered voices carried by the wind, a chorus of eerie, inhuman tones. I shivered, wondering if my imagination was playing tricks on me. With dawn's first light, I explained my predicament to Daniel, hoping to leave as soon as possible. But as he led me to the door, his demeanor shifted, his eyes narrowing with a sinister gleam. He spoke of needing someone to share his isolated life, hinting at a sinister motive lurking beneath the surface. Terrified, I pushed past him and ran into the cold morning air. I fled into the surrounding woods, hoping to put as much distance as possible between myself and the madman. Eventually, a search party found me, and I was rescued from the wilderness. As I recounted my harrowing experience to the authorities, I couldn't help but wonder about the stories I had heard and the terrifying reality that lurked in the middle of nowhere. The scariest monsters, I realized, weren't the ones that came from the realm of myths and legends, but those who walked among us, hiding in the shadows of isolation and madness. In the desolation of a moonless night, I found myself driving along a deserted highway that stretched through the heart of nowhere. My name is Daniel, and my journey was a desperate attempt to mend a broken heart by immersing myself in solitude and nature. The trees on either side of the road cast long, haunting shadows in the dim glow of my headlights. It had been a long and solitary drive, and I relished the sense of isolation until I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror, closing in relentlessly. At first, I dismissed it as a fellow traveler on the same lonely road, but as the vehicle drew closer, I realized that something was not quite right. Panic began to claw at my chest as the car stuck to my tail like a shadow refusing to let go. My journey had begun with a heavy heart, my life marked by the recent end of a long-term relationship. Seeking solace and a fresh start, I had embarked on a road trip through the remote wilderness. The isolation and solitude were meant to be my refuge, a balm for my wounded spirit. But as the strange car continued to tailgate me through the empty night, that solitude began to feel more like vulnerability. I tried to shake off the pursuing vehicle, speeding up and slowing down, but it matched my pace with uncanny precision. My heart pounded as I realized that there was something deeply unsettling about this relentless pursuit, something that went beyond mere coincidence. My mind raced, conjuring up thoughts of deranged highway predators or desperate criminals on the run. The tension in the car grew palpable as I frantically considered my options. With no cell signal in this remote area, I was left with few choices. The only one that seemed remotely viable was to find a public place, somewhere with other people who could potentially intervene. The nearest town was miles away, but I decided to make a run for it. Veering off the highway onto a dirt road, I headed for the faint glimmer of a roadside diner in the distance. My heart raced, and my mind was filled with paranoid thoughts about who might be behind the wheel of the pursuing vehicle. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were closing in on me with every passing mile. The little diner came into view, a haven of light and potential safety. With a sigh of relief, I pulled into the parking lot and rushed inside, my breathless explanation of the situation drawing concerned looks from the patrons. The waitress Jenny called the local sheriff, and I huddled in the well-lit diner, surrounded by sympathetic strangers, my fear beginning to ebb away. Time passed slowly, and I began to doubt the urgency of the situation. Maybe it was just a fellow traveler who had no idea how unnerving their tailgating had become. But when the sheriff finally arrived, his grave expression told a different story. He explained that the car following me was stolen, involved in a violent crime spree, and the individuals behind the wheel were desperate fugitives, wanted for a string of robberies and assaults. My blood ran cold as he described their dangerous history and their willingness to do anything to evade capture. In the end, the sheriff arranged for me to be escorted safely to the nearest town and assured me that the fugitives were being pursued. As I continued my journey, shaken but alive, I couldn't help but reflect on the thin line between solitude and vulnerability, and the realization that sometimes, even in the most isolated places, danger can lurk in the shadows, just waiting to follow you down the desolate highway of the middle of nowhere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast expanse of wilderness, I stood alone on the desolate road. My name is Detective Alex Walker, and my journey had brought me to the fringes of civilization, chasing a notorious criminal who had eluded capture for far too long. I had tracked the felon's trail through dense forests and forgotten back roads, finally arriving at this remote location as the last light of dusk clung to the sky. With the growing shadows, my heart quickened, a sense of apprehension washing over me, for I knew that my target was close, hidden somewhere in the abyss that lay before me. My relentless pursuit of the criminal had begun weeks ago, driven by a personal vendetta born from the tragic murder of my partner, Officer Martinez. Our investigation had led us to the notorious fugitive, David Kessler, a master of deception and evasion. My resolve to bring him to justice was unshakable, and I had followed his trail deep into the unforgiving wilderness, where he thought he could lose me. The desolation of this forsaken road held the last known coordinates of Kessler's whereabouts. My pulse quickened as I scanned the eerie surroundings, my footsteps echoing through the oppressive silence. I gripped my service weapon, my fingers tense on the trigger. The weight of the situation hung in the air, a visceral tension that grew with every step deeper into this abyss. Suddenly, the air grew still, and I knew I wasn't alone. As I edged closer to the silhouette of a rundown cabin in the near distance, my instincts screamed that this was the moment I had been waiting for. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding, and pushed the rickety door open. Inside, the cabin was shrouded in gloom. the air thick with the smell of decay and neglect. I could hear the faint rustling of movement in the corner. There he was, David Kessler, crouched in the darkness like a cornered animal. His eyes gleamed with a predatory glint, and he held a glinting blade in his hand. With the last traces of daylight filtering through the cracked windows, I could see the desperation etched across his face. A tense standoff ensued as we stared each other down, each aware that there was no turning back from this fateful encounter. Kessler's breathing was ragged, his muscles coiled like a spring, ready to strike at a moment's notice. I knew that I couldn't let this fugitive escape again, not after the trail of destruction he had left in his wake. My voice shook as I ordered him to drop the weapon, but he only glared at me with defiance. In the dim light, I could see the murderous intent in his eyes, and I knew that I had no other choice. With a heavy heart, I pulled the trigger, the gunshot reverberating through the cabin. Kessler crumpled to the ground, his hostile presence extinguished. As I radioed for backup, I couldn't help but think of Officer Martinez and the closure this moment would bring. My pursuit of justice was complete, but it had come at a heavy cost. The shadows of this remote wilderness bore witness to the final chapter of a relentless manhunt, a story that would be whispered in hushed tones among law enforcement circles. The outcome of this encounter haunted me for weeks, my dreams plagued by the image of Kessler's malevolent gaze. The journey had been a test of determination and resolve, and as I left the middle of nowhere, I couldn't help but reflect on the thin line that separates the hunter from the hunted, and the relentless pursuit of justice that can lead a person to the darkest corners of the human soul.